So let's talk about the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to talk about three structures in particular. I want to talk about the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and the reflection pool that runs between the both of them. So again, that's the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and the reflection pool that runs between the both of them. So you have this interesting relationship that exists between these three structures and the Egyptian or the Kemetic Ankh. It's a very interesting relationship that's not always apparent at first glance. In fact, if I'm being honest, if you were to take an aerial view of all of Washington, D.C., you would notice that there's a lot of symbolism that is baked into the landscape of that city. So much so that it would be kind of negligent to assume that this city was designed by people who did not have a keen understanding of the mysteries of our ancestors. There was a lot of thought, a lot of attention that went into what buildings were designed, where they were placed, and what the symbolic meaning of those buildings were. And I say all that to say that I'm not going to take a deep dive into all of the structures in Washington, D.C. It would be a lot, and honestly, I don't know all of them. But I did want to focus on these three structures in particular. And again, that's the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and the reflection pool. Now, later on, I will draw an interesting parallel between Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, Jesus Christ, and this National Mall. But before we do that, I feel it's important that we have a fundamental understanding of these three structures and their relationship or their connection to the Egyptian Ankh. And probably the easiest place to begin would be with the Washington Monument, which is the large obelisk, which stands at about, I think it's about 555 feet high. It is arguably the most recognizable structure in Washington, D.C. If you've ever been there, you've probably seen it. Even if you haven't been there, it is a structure that most people are familiar with. And the obelisk in ancient times represented the erected penis. It was a symbol of masculinity, of strength, of virility. It was the symbol of the Egyptian god Osiris, which was the god of fertility and the god of the underworld. Osiris is represented in the Ankh as the vertical line, which itself stands for an erected penis, strength, virility. Let us also remember that the Washington Monument is dedicated to George Washington, and George Washington is revered by many in the United States to be the father of the country, the first president of the United States. So once again, within this obelisk, you have this symbol of masculinity, this symbol of fatherhood. Now, going across from the monument, facing westward, you have the Lincoln Memorial. And whereas the Washington Memorial is very tall and very, very narrow, representing the erected penis, the Lincoln Memorial, is very low and wide, representing the female womb, which is a symbol of the abyss from which all life springs forth. And the womb being a symbol of life, it is also a symbol of freedom. And thus you have this statue of Abraham Lincoln, himself being a symbol of freedom for America, sitting on a throne, him being the president who allegedly set the slaves free. And so the Lincoln Memorial is symbolic of the divine female of Isis. And Isis, in the symbol of the Ankh, is represented by the oval symbol, the oval that sits atop of the vertical line. And so you have Osiris and you have Isis, male and female. And when these two come together, when male and female come together, they produce a child, which is a 50-50 genetic reflection of both the father and the mother. And thus, in the reflection pool, we see this relationship. We see the child, we see the Horus, in that we have both structures being reflected into the pool. So you have the symbol of the father in the reflection of the Washington Monument, and you have the symbol of the mother in the reflection of the Lincoln Memorial. And in the symbol of the Ankh, Horus is the horizontal line that both unites and separates Isis and Osiris, just as the child is the unification of both parents. Again, the child is a 50-50 genetic reflection of both father and mother. And the child is neither father or mother. The child is their own separate being. And so you have the unification and the separation seen in the child. Every child is in the Horus position. And again, we also see this relationship in the reflection pool, because the reflection pool reflects both structures, but the pool itself is neither of the structures. And we see that both of these structures are made of stone, symbolizing that which is finite and lifeless, whereas the pool is made of water, symbolizing that which is fluid, that which is infinite, that which is life, right? And so there you have your holy Ankh, which symbolizes the father, the mother, and the child. And again, at this location, you have these three structures which symbolize the father, the mother, and the child. And we could delve a lot deeper, but I feel like that gives us enough information. You know, we see the relationship between these structures and their connection with the Egyptian Ankh, and now we're able to move forward on to Martin Luther King in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So let's talk about that. All right. So Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in August of 1963, right? He could have given this speech anywhere else in the country, could have given this speech anywhere else in Washington, D.C., but this location was chosen for a reason, right? And the reason is somewhat obvious. Obviously, they wanted to have this speech delivered from a location that symbolized freedom, and so you have the statue of Abraham Lincoln, which is set behind Martin Luther King as he gives this speech. And you have the cameramen, which are switching back and forth from the face of Abraham Lincoln to the face of Martin Luther King in order to draw on that parallel. We get it. But might there be some other parallels that we didn't notice? That's what I want to talk about, right? Let's jump into those. And first, I wanted to point out the fact that Martin Luther King is not placed on the same level with Abraham Lincoln. They actually have him a level below Abraham Lincoln as he's giving his speech. And so you have, again, that large statue of Abraham Lincoln behind him, sitting on his throne, looking down on the people, kind of like in this God or in this father position. Again, Abraham Lincoln being a symbol of freedom, him being the president who allegedly freed the slaves. And after he allegedly freed the slaves, what happens to Abraham Lincoln? He gets assassinated. He gets murdered. Does that sound familiar? Does that remind you of somebody? Does that remind you of another man who many years ago was reputed for having saved or set the people free, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And then after doing so, he was crucified, he was murdered. Isn't that interesting? And so you have this very interesting relationship that exists between these two individuals that are almost 2,000 years apart, right? Two men being reputed to have set their people free and then paying the ultimate price afterwards. And now in 1963, here we are, we have this statue of Abraham Lincoln. He's sitting on his throne looking down at the people, and right below him is the symbolic sun in Martin Luther King, and he is preaching the gospel of freedom to the people, right? Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. In the speech that Martin Luther King gives, and if you have not heard it, I highly recommend that you do so. It's a beautiful speech, because in this speech, there again, we have Martin Luther King speaking about the importance of two opposites coming together in order to attain life, in order to attain freedom. And I find that fascinating that he's given this speech at a location where you have these two structures that were designed to reflect the unification of these opposites, the unification of the two becoming one in order to bring forth life. And Martin Luther King is recognized as being the face of the civil rights movement, that movement being one that culminated in Black Americans being given the freedom to vote. And after they received that freedom, what happened to Martin Luther King? He was assassinated. He was murdered. Isn't that interesting? And so you have this very interesting parallel that exists between these three people that were centuries and millennia apart. But it doesn't stop there. It gets deeper. Here's another nugget. Martin Luther King is giving his speech at the Lincoln Memorial facing eastward towards the Washington Monument, which again is a symbol of the erected penis of Osiris. Osiris is the Egyptian god who is recognized as being the god who brought freedom and truth to his people. And then after doing so, he was murdered by his brother Seth. Isn't that interesting? And so you have the god Osiris, who brought freedom to his people and was murdered, standing across Abraham Lincoln, who brought freedom to his people and was murdered, who is looking down on Martin Luther King, who brought freedom to his people and was murdered. And Martin Luther King was a Christian that believed in a Messiah that brought freedom to his people and was murdered. And all of this is taking place at this one location in 1963. And in case you're wondering, there is now a monument at this same location devoted to Martin Luther King. It is a structure, a carving of Martin Luther King being hewn, being drawn out of a mountain, symbolizing the one who brought the two together. And we're just scratching the surface. We really could go deeper, but I feel like with what we just talked about, there's enough there to just really think about, you know? And I find it fascinating how there seems to be these parallels, there seems to be this pattern which is baked into the very movement and mindset of society, right? So much so that it almost makes you wonder, what interesting paradoxes and parallels might you discover if you just took the time to observe what's around you?